They left me on my 75th birthday with a carton of noodles and a card that said, "Have a nice day, Grandma," while my own daughter posted sunlit photos from a beach I paid for. They talk about 5 to 15 seconds of shock for a thumbnail, a line that punches and holds. So here it is, plain and small and jagged. I ate alone on my 75th birthday while my family was on vacation using my money. That's the headline. That's the ache. But the truth that followed this small, terrible scene is longer, layered, older than the photos on their phones. And it begins in a house that smells like worn wood and lavender soap. My name is Alara. I say it in the quiet of the sitting room because names are anchors and I like to feel steady. The house is small, wood floorboards that sigh in the heat, a table with one cigarette burn and a ring of darker varnish from a glass set down too often. There are frames on the mantel, cracked sepia edges on wedding pictures, a son in a faded uniform who always looked as if he might laugh in the middle of a sentence, a daughter at 20, bright as a light bulb. There's a shelf with chipped porcelain, a radio that still clicks when I tune it, and lace curtains that catch the late sun and turn the room into a cathedral of dust motes. Tonight the light is low and warm. My granddaughter Noor, she's 9, knees still soft with childhood, sits cross-legged on the rug by my feet. Her hair smells like jasmine and chalk. She looks up at me with those enormous, curious eyes that children have before the world teaches them to blink away things we don't want to see. She has a habit of touching the grooves in my hands, tracing the long white line from where I burned myself on a kettle years ago. "Why did that happen, Grandma?" she asks. She means the thumbnail headline. She means the hole the family left in the corner of the living room where they should have been. I tell stories for a living now, not the kind you see on stages or in bright lights, but the kind that sit on your lap and warm your hands. This one starts before the plates were stacked, before the tickets were booked, before the texts full of sun emojis. It begins with me as a young woman scraping jam from jars and learning how to count a bread loaf twice. I talk, and as I talk, the room becomes a reel of softer, grainier images. I let Noor see the younger me. When I was 20, I married Julian under a sky that threatened rain. We were both poor then, but that didn't mean we were empty. He had a laugh like an oven door slamming, sudden, loud, warm. We worked in a little bakery that smelled like yeast and hope. I learned how to knot dough with my hands so that the loaves looked like hugs. People would say, "The bread tastes like home," and I'd tuck that into my pocket like a coin. There was a time the family was small and love was what I thought would keep everything from splitting. We would sit at this very table, not much taller than we needed to be, and share something sweet. Julian would talk about a future that fit into his pockets, a house painted in an optimistic pale, children who would learn to whistle, holidays where we'd see the sea. I believed in those small fortunes. I still believe in them when I want to be gentle with the past. But life, as I discovered, chisels differently than we plan. Julian got sick 10 years later, something fierce and quiet. He carried his coughing like coal in his pockets. We used what little we had to fix him, to stitch him back, but the rest of the world keeps turning whether or not you're holding on to someone's hand. Hospitals took more than money. They took my certainty. They took nights where I stood under a ceiling fan and listened to the clock scream. The bakery closed its doors, the ovens cold and indifferent. We sold the little car that had been stubborn as a mule and kept on smiling because that's what you do when you have to. We kept because smiling is cheaper than explaining to your children how the world can let you go. When Julian died, I learned a harder math. Grief is subtractive. Out of the small fortune we'd built, the tiny savings account that had been our stubborn, thrifty privacy, I kept a portion aside, folded and labeled, "for later." I wasn't sentimental about the money. I didn't keep jewelry or keychains. I kept ledgers and a knowing that sometimes the only way to hold yourself upright is to have a little rope of your own. I told the children, them being small then, full of plans and late-night music, that the account was for emergencies. "For later," I said, which is the same phrase a parent uses for every delicate, unfinished thing. Over the years, I paid for school books, for broken pipes, for funerals when distant cousins needed something to be done properly. I sewed quilts, said prayers, made a pie when someone moved into a new flat. I kept my mouth closed when the granddaughter called because she knew I'd come. That's the shape of being elderly. People see you as a place to drop their suitcases. You'd think that after all that giving, there's a moment of rest where your name is still and the world finally says, thank you. My 75th should have been that. A small cake, a few candles, the family crowded and laughing until the walls echoed. Instead, that day I found a stamped postcard on the hall table. Sunshine, turquoise water, wish you were here. And a signature that read, with love, your children. The stamp was from an island I had once pointed to on a pamphlet and called a dream. Noor tugged my sleeve. Didn't they at least call? Her voice is quiet but fierce in the way children can be when they try on adult anger. Didn't they say happy birthday? They called, I said. They called and sent a picture of waves. It's strange to feel both anger and a small, aching humor at the same time, like remembering you forgot the milk but finding a coin instead. There were texts, yes, smiling faces, cocktails, sunsets, and a group photo with everyone dipped in sun and laughter. Meanwhile, I had a carton of noodles and a candle I'd found in the back of a drawer. I set the candle in the center of my plate because small theatrics are allowed at 75. I put the noodle pack in scalding water and sat at the table, and Noor sat opposite me with her legs swinging. She watched me like she watched the night sky when it was too much for her to think about. We didn't have any money, my daughter wrote in a message that lit up my old phone. The lie was tight and glossy. We had to use yours, Mom. It was an emergency. Emergency, emergency. Words that should burst like balloons when they're used to cover an absence. She called it an emergency, but the photos were all sunset and pockets of leisure. She used my money to buy them a week of sun and then sent me a postcard of a sky I might never see. There's more shame in being taken than in being poor. Shame is a personal small stone you swallow and it sits under your tongue. I felt it like a winter that never quite thawed. I felt stupid for trusting. I felt older, yes, but also foolish in a way that finally unclenched something in me. You can't be angry at grief forever, but you can be angry at an injustice that is avoidable. I told Noor some of this that night, and she listened as if each sentence were a spoonful of honey and vinegar. Why did they do it? She asked, thumb pressed to the seam of my palm. People sometimes choose the easiest path, I said. We cover our mistakes with small lies. And sometimes, darling, people forget they ever loved you properly. My voice shook. Sometimes the breath is like a rope you have to pull yourself back up with. Noor reached across and grabbed my hand. Her fingers are warm and solid. We'll fix it, she said, as if fixing was a craftsman's job and not the complicated, slow business of defining self and consequence. Children tell you the things you want to hear when hope is a puddle they splash through. I wanted to tell her that sometimes fixing is impossible, that some things only mend into something new, but I hugged her instead. That evening unfolded into memories. And as music played on the old radio, an old song they used to dance to at weddings, my mind did what memory does. It strayed back to when I'd first learned to keep my accounts. Back then, my ledger was a thick book with brown edges. I wrote everything down, the coins I hid in jars, the nickels slipped into the lining of my coat, the deposits and small, stubborn interest that felt like a soft promise. I had opened that account quietly at a bank across town. An old woman with a sensible hat and a voice that said, "This is for later." The teller, a young man with a tie that always teetered, smiled and slid the passbook across. The bank smelled like lemon and paper and a kind of safety I thought would last. That passbook lived in a drawer, wrapped in tissue with a ribbon I forgot I had tied. When Julian died, I didn't spend it. I didn't think of spending because that was not how we had been raised. Saving was a deeper instinct than spending. But over time, as children moved and plans became louder than visits, I let them help me with small things. Pay the electricity when I missed the date, help with the more complicated banking. It was a favor that felt like care. I signed permission slips, I told them where the bills were kept, I gave them passwords that I thought were only for convenience. This is the beginning of the conflict. Trust given as a bridge. The bridge burned with a lighter flick. I didn't notice at first. People take until there's nothing left to take, and we have trouble seeing that when our hearts are trained to believe in people we love. The texts came over months. "Mom, just cover the rent this month. I'll pay you back, and can you wire me $200 for the car? And we'll pay you back." The tone was the same as a stitch used to repair a tear, and I sewed and sewed, believing the seam would hold. What I didn't notice was the way small requests had become habitual. Instead of being occasional, they threaded through every month. I thought what I always thought, that family is for scaffolding, until a postcard arrived and the scaffolding was empty. Noor sat up and tilted her head. "Did you tell anyone?" she asked. I thought about telling the bank, the police, my children, the neighbors, the paper. There were pride issues, of course. Pride is a sort of currency you pay when you don't want to be a burden. But mostly, I thought about the ways your voice is smaller when you've been listening for so long. I had this peculiar, sorrowful fear that if I shouted, the walls would only echo me back. I had the image of the family returning, passport stamps drying in their pockets, looking sheepish and then, under a table, like a small animal returning to a nest, finding the last of the jam jars emptied by someone else. There is a scene I cannot forget, the day I checked the account. I walked slowly to the bank, hands tucked in my coat pockets against an old nor'easter wind that had come early that year. The bank smelled the same as it always had, lemon and paper, and the teller's smile was a tremor in a face I'd known for years. I handed over my passbook, the leather soft from touch, and the young man frowned and clicked a pen. "Ma'am," he said, "there were some withdrawals last month." He said it delicately, as if numbers were not sharp enough to be knives. I felt something curl and snap inside me. "Show me," I said. The printout was a small, cruel thing. Withdrawals to accounts I recognized by name. My daughter's bank name, my son-in-law's card. Transfers labeled Family Emergency. There were dates that matched birthdays and anniversaries, and one that matched the day of the postcard. My hands shook, and I had to sit down on a bank chair that was more uncomfortable than sympathy. I could hear the clock ticking, like a judge counting time in small, impartial beats. I didn't shout. I simply asked for the bank manager, and then I went home with the paper folded in my purse like a wounded bird. I walked the same floorboards that sighed. Noor followed me into the kitchen, and she watched as I crumpled into a chair. The kettle whistled and I let it, because noise distracts and I was tired of the weight of thoughts. "How much?" she asked. "More than I thought," I said. "Less than they'll ever need to look like sorry." Noor's face did that grown-up thing children do when they try to puzzle out an adult problem. The muscles around the mouth tighten as if to hold courage in. "Are they coming back?" she asked. She asked questions without the guardrails adults build. The innocence of a child is not ignorance. It's an unarmored insistence on truth. I told her, "I don't know." The wag of the bird's wings in my chest said something else. That I had to do something, but the something was not yet shaped into words. I promised, to her and quietly to myself, that I would find out, and that I would do it not with fury alone, but with care that steadies. I told her a story then about my sister, someone I loved and who had taught me to sew hems by moonlight. She had been like a second mother to me. She had sat at this table and mended shirts with a needle that moved like an affirmation. When she died, she left me a note and a small box containing photographs and a key. She wrote simply, "For when you need a little proof." I had kept the key tucked behind the passbook for decades, not because I knew what it would open, but because I valued things that might one day become useful. I reached into the drawer and handed Noor the key. It was small and heavy, made of brass, with a round head warm from years of being touched. "This belonged to my sister," I said. "I never used it. But sometimes keys find the locks they were meant for at the exact time the heart needs them." Noor held it like a secret. "Maybe it opens the vacation house," she whispered, and I laughed, half a bark of disbelief, half a sound like a wind that has been let out of a bottle. Then she stood and hugged me tight. For a moment, I was a child again, and someone had put a cape around me. We ate the noodles in silence, which is sometimes a language of its own. I told her more of my past, the small humiliations, the joys, the times I had stood on this very porch and watched the leaves blow like loose coins. I told her how Julian once pressed a coin into my palm and said, "Buy the bread, Ilara, buy the bread and the moon." He was always extravagant with metaphors. Night came and the lace curtains pulled close, turning the world outside into a soft, murky painting. Noor fell asleep on the couch with my cardigan over her small shoulders and the key clutched in her fist. I sat with the list of withdrawals and the postcard and the odd, aching sense that something had shifted. The house was quiet as a held breath. In the dim by the window, I found myself thinking of small rituals that keep a life tethered to gentleness. I took a match and lit the candle I had used for my solitary birthday dinner. The flame threw soft light over the passbook on the table. The numbers on the paper looked like they belonged to someone else. They were, after all. They had been moved away like autumn furniture into storage. But the life built from them, the afternoons of quilting, the way my granddaughter learned to knot her shoelaces, those things were still here. I promised myself one act of clarity before I slept. Tomorrow, I would go to the bank again, but this time with more than a trembling heart. I would ask for explanations and receipts and perhaps decide what to do with the knowledge. I felt the old muscle of resolve flexing. Resolve is not vengeance. It's a steadiness you adopt when the world yields to small cruelties. As I turned the key over in my hand, Noor stirred and opened her eyes. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked, as if being okay were a choice I could simply pick from a shelf. "I will be," I said, and I wanted it to be true. The word sat there, like a seed in winter soil, quiet and waiting. Outside, beyond the lace curtains, beyond the streetlights and the night, I could feel the sense of a story beginning to peel open. This is where the cliffhanger must be, the moment that says, something's been damaged and now something else will be found. So here it is. Tucked in the groove under the passbook, where I had kept my sister's key for decades, there was also a small folded letter I did not recognize. The handwriting was not mine, not Julian's, and not the spiky notes my daughter sometimes left. It had been placed there like a dare. I smoothed it with fingers that remembered how to make pastry. The paper was older than the postcard from the island and had the faint smell of smoke and lavender. The top line read, "If you ever need to know how to see a thing for what it is, follow this." My heart did a peculiar, anticipatory flutter. I read no further. I will not read further tonight. The letter, the key, the bank printout, these were small objects heavy with possibility. I looked at Noor sleeping and felt the stubborn, bright ache of being a woman who would not let the world decide her fate without a fight. Tomorrow I would open the letter. Tomorrow I would ask questions. But for now, the room was a cathedral of dust motes and stories, and the candle burnt low. If you've ever felt the sting of being overlooked by those you loved, tell me. Share your story in the comments. Tell me what you did when a small betrayal pressed like a stone. Tell me what you wish someone had done for you. I'll read them as I sit with this letter, and I will not be alone in the reading. I tucked the folded letter back into the passbook and slid the book into the drawer where I'd hidden the key. When I locked the drawer, the click sounded like someone closing a book. But the lock didn't fit the key I had. The brass key in Noor's small hand had a number etched on the rim I had never noticed before. It matched a locker number I haven't seen in years. A locker in an old storage facility on the edge of town where Julian used to take things he couldn't bear to toss away. I had been meaning to check it for months and never did. Tomorrow I will go to the storage facility. I will open locker number 17. Share your story in the comments. And if you've ever found a key in your life, literal or not, tell me what it opened for you. That postcard sat on my hall table like a small, cheerful lie. But this is part 2, and the lie was only the beginning. You remember locker number 17? I went there the next morning, a slow, determined thing with Noor at my side, the brass key warm in her palm. If part 1 was the ache, this is the unpeeling. The search, the memory, the quiet detective work of an old woman who has nothing to lose but dignity. We left before dawn. The sky had the thin blue of a sheet you keep for emergencies, cool and promising. The city was waking up in small noises. A delivery truck coughed. Someone laughed too loudly at a bus stop. Noor had a thermos clutched between her knees like a talisman, and her cardigan cinched tight. She wore her hair in 2 braids, and each braid had a small blue ribbon tied at the end. I like how children tie things into their hair as if they are securing their hearts. She held my hand and did not let go. The storage facility smelled like old cardboard and metal, ordinary, practical. There was a woman at the front desk with a watchful face and a name tag that said Maya. She had her hair in a bun and the kind of eyes that ask polite questions before they answer. I told her the number and she pointed to a long row of lockers, steel doors like teeth. My fingers shook when I fit the brass key into the padlock. It turned with a sound that made me think of old clocks and trains, mechanical, unavoidable. The door rolled up and the air that escaped was the smell of time itself. It was cooler in there somehow, a pocket of air where dust had settled in a horizontal patience. There were things in the locker, boxes, a folded blanket that smelled faintly of cedar, a trunk with a leather strap, and a paper-wrapped bundle tied with string. On top of everything else lay a shoebox, not fancy, with a sticker on the lid that read in a hand I recognized instantly, Julian's Things. I sat on an overturned milk crate and watched Noor rummage through. Children are detectives without cynicism. She moved things carefully as if handling the bones of a small animal. She found old letters first, handwritten notes Julian had tucked away, giggling notes about the bread, a receipt for a metal sign he'd bought for the bakery, a ticket stub to a movie he liked, and a dried wildflower pressed between the pages. His handwriting made me smile and ache at the same time. Salah, when he wrote, always curved the letters like people smiling. Under the letters was a slim envelope addressed to me in a hand I hadn't seen for years, my sister's looping script. My heart did that thing it does when it recognizes music. The envelope contained a short note folded thrice. I unfolded it like one unfolds something fragile. It read, Ilara, if ever you need proof, check the ledger in the tin. Oh, the ledger. I had almost forgotten the tin until the corner of it showed under a stack of old menus. It was small and dented and smelled faintly of oil and lavender. I lifted the lid with fingers that knew how to do careful things, and there, the ledger rested, its cover scuffed, and the pages full of small, careful numbers. My name was on the first page, in my own hand, the entries deliberate, the little ticks in the margin where I double-checked myself. I flipped through and found what I half expected and half hoped would never exist. There were notes of deposits and withdrawals, but there were also references, dates and names and numbers with arrows. And then my stomach dropped, because next to one of the withdrawals someone had written, in hurried, unmistakable ink, transferred to family account, emergency. The handwriting was my daughter's. I recognized the slanted way she looped her Y's. Noor looked up at me with a face suddenly serious. Grandma? I kept reading. There were receipts taped into the pages, coffee shop slips, a petty cash withdrawal from a bank, a transfer confirmation that matched the postcard's date. The numbers weren't monstrous individually. They were the small, steady extractions that, over months and years, add up to the thing that knocks a life off its platform. We sat there for a long time. There is a kind of silence that isn't empty. It holds the shape of what you will do next. Noor slid the ledger into her backpack as if she were putting a kitten away to keep it safe. What do we do now? She asked. We gather, I said. We remember. We prepare. I sounded smaller than I felt. It is strange how the need to be stoic can feel like a costume you put on with trembling hands. We took copies of everything. The storage facility had an old photocopier. In the front office, and Maya, bless her eyes, didn't. Ask for my ID when she heard the word Julian. She looked like she believed in small kindnesses and made them anyway. I gave her a coin I'd kept for emergencies. She refused it at first, then took it with a small bow. You learn to accept other people's pity sometimes, like you accept rain when you're already soaked. Back home, with the ledger spread on the table like evidence in a courtroom, Noor sat cross-legged and asked questions like bullets. Why did they take it? She said. Her voice was low. There was a gravity to 9-year-old indignation that stuns you with its rawness. They chose comfort, I said. They chose the easy shore over the person who'd been their harbor. My voice was full of history, my history, and the room felt heavy with years. I told her more then, about the small sacrifices I had made that were never noticed, the jobs I took that kept us fed when Julian's breath became thin, the winter nights I worked a late shift mending other people's clothes for pennies, the many times I said it's okay when it wasn't. Flashbacks unspooled in my head, grainy, cinematic. I saw myself at 26, standing in a laundromat under buzzing fluorescent lights, my hands wet with soap and other people's misfortune. I remember the smell of fabric softener and metal coins, the way the dryer's drums spun like a world on repeat. I had taken work that smelled of bleach and hope. I remember Julian's hands trembling as he passed me the last of the tips. I remember telling him we'd be fine. I remember the day I taught my daughter to count. She was small then, hair in a messy knot, an apron 3 sizes too big, and we sat at the kitchen table and I drew little squares for each rupee. I fussed and explained that saving is prayer in coin form. We laughed then. She promised me that when she grew, she would be a saver like me. These are the tender betrayals, promises made on the cheap, broken with the same carelessness as a dish tossed like a thought. Noor's eyes were wet and sharp. "Will they be mad?" she asked, the child in her assuming the adult role of defender, protecting me like a seedling umbrella. "Maybe," I said. "Maybe they'll be embarrassed. Maybe they'll be angry. They'll certainly make excuses. People do what's hard to say out loud in daylight." I had been inside those apologies before. I knew the language. We were in trouble. It was an emergency. We couldn't help it. The sentences are soft as cotton, but can strangle you with their thinness. We made a plan. Not a lawyerly one, yet, but a plan nonetheless. Make photocopies. Gather all records. Ask the bank for more detailed statements. Call the one relative who still had my trust, an uncle who lived in a small town, and see if he could come by and sit with us. I wanted to confront them, yes, but not in a way that would feed drama. Drama is a sport. I am not in the mood to play. I wanted recognition, not spectacle. I wanted them to see what their choices had done. I wanted the ledger to be a mirror, not a weapon. That afternoon I called the bank. My voice felt strange, like a thread attempting to stitch a wound. They asked me to come in. I did. The bank office smelled the same, and the young man with the teetering tie had a frown that was half apology and half modern indifference. He gave me printouts and more dates and more numbers. I kept them close like a rosary. We cross-referenced, and the patterns emerged like lines in an etching. Small withdrawals monthly, labeled family help, urgent medical, car fix, deposit back next month. There were scalpels of human frailty in the handwriting, notes about illness that might have been true on occasion. There were also lavish restaurant receipts on days when the postcard sun was high. It's hard to fix people who choose comfort over care. That's not to say all of their choices are unforgivable. Life is complicated, but trust, once eroded, is brittle as old glass. There comes a point when you have to decide whether to be a continuing bank or a boundary. That decision is as personal as death and as clinical as a surgical room. I remember a night several years earlier when my daughter came over in a flurry of papers and plans. She had that look invariably, excited, slightly panicked, as if the world were a chase she needed to win. She told me she needed a bit while she got on her feet again. "I'll pay you back, Mama," she said, and her hands opened like a vine. I gave her the number for the account, and even in my gullibility, authorized small transfers so she could use my card in emergencies. My generosity was a hinge. I never imagined it would become a revolving door. In those flashbacks, I also saw myself more tenderly. There are moments of ridiculous pride. The time I saved a penny jar into a bundle of rupees that got us through a heater repair. The time I taught Noor to bake with Julian's old spoon. The times I would lie awake stitching a hem by the light of a bedside lamp after everyone else slept. I did these things not because I wanted praise, but because somebody had to do them. The ledger, the storage locker, these were part of that quiet labor. We did something else then that surprised me. We called a family meeting. Not the shouty, accusatory kind with doors slamming and accusations flung like plates. I wanted conversation. Cold coffee conversation, perhaps, but a conversation nonetheless. I told myself I wanted reasons, not drama. I wanted words that might explain the yawning gap between photographs and the small, consistent withdrawals documented with the precise cruelty of a bank statement. My daughter arrived first. She looked younger than her years. It's funny how people try to look young when they know they're being judged. She greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek and then did that awkward sidestep where she didn't make eye contact. My son-in-law lingered behind her, his hands in his pockets like someone who had practiced being casual in front of mirrors. They had that desert-light look, tan and relaxed, smelling faintly of sunscreen. Noor sat between us and watched the way family can suddenly turn into an audience. "I thought we were doing this privately," my daughter said, plucking at an old seam in her sleeve. "Mom, she started, then stopped. I let her stop. Sometimes the pause is a gift you give someone when you want them to find their own words. "We have the ledger," I said. My voice echoed in the room in a way that made my chest stutter. "I found things in storage. I want to know why you thought it was okay to take from me." Her face shifted, shame like a tide pulling back. "It was never like that," she said. "We used it because we needed help. There were things, medical bills, a leak in the roof. Your name was the only one we could call." She used the language of crisis. She had practiced these lines, and that was the worst part. Noor's small voice rose then and cut through the practiced phrases. "You posted pictures," she said. "You went to the beach. You used Grandma's money. You said it was an emergency." My daughter's throat moved. She looked at Noor and then at me. In that look was a small machine, human defensiveness grinding into something like confession. "We were ashamed," she said. "We didn't want to tell you we were failing. We thought we'd fix it before you ever knew. Why not ask?" I asked. "Why take, then tell a story later? That's not fixing. That's funding your guilt." They were quiet then, as if conversation had become a thing that needed to be coaxed out of a thick husk. My son-in-law mumbled something about mismanagement. The arguments were small and precise, the kind that reduce enormous heartache into tiny blame-ridden atoms. I wanted to be angry, and I allowed myself to be. But anger is a hot coal you hold until your fingers blister. I wanted a map, an explanation with roads on it. There's also a different kind of response people give, one I have seen in others and once gave myself, the attempt to rewrite memory. "We didn't know," they said. "We thought you had other money." That's how people deflect. They make the problem someone else's by making it a misunderstanding. It's nicer to say, "We were confused," than to say, "We were selfish." They promised to return what they could. They offered me a payment plan. My daughter cried in bursts, sharp, theatrical. There were apologies that smelled like guilt. They asked if I would think of it as a loan. "We'll pay you back," she said again. The repetition of the sentence was a ritual that was supposed to make it true. I wondered if I was being childish when I told them firmly, "I don't want your money back like a receipt. I want accountability, truth, and a change of behavior." Accountability sounded like a big word in the small room, and I felt its weight like a stone in my pocket. Noor surprised me. She told them calmly, with the unwavering logic children have, that money doesn't grow on birthdays. It doesn't just appear in the sky, she said. It comes from people who are careful. The room was quiet in that peculiar way that makes you aware of your breathing. My daughter looked like she might open her mouth and speak, and maybe she did. But the words were thin, like tinfoil. We agreed on a few things. No more automatic access to my accounts. A schedule for repayments. A small financial audit to ensure transparency. And the notion that leadership in a family is not inherited, but practiced daily. They left with the ledger in their bag, promising to think it over, and the house grew quiet, like a clause signed. After they left, I thought about forgiveness. People often ask, "Will you forgive them?" As if forgiveness is dessert you choose after a meal. Forgiveness is not optional sugar. It's a slow process, something you practice in the morning when you choose how to put your feet on the floor. I decided I would practice it, but not without boundaries. You can forgive and still choose not to trust. Forgiveness isn't the same as giving someone the keys to the house again. That night, Noor and I made tea and sat at the table, the ledger between us like a map of small betrayals. She leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "Grandma, what's the worst thing people do?" Children have a way of asking grand, dangerous questions because they think you hold the universe like an afternoon shawl. "The worst thing," I said slowly, "is to turn away from someone who trusted you. Not because they were perfect, but because they were yours." I felt the bitter truth of that sentence settle like dust. Flashback. I remembered days when we were so poor that our bread was a small, solemn thing. We would ration it like stories. Julian and I would press a penny into each other's hands, like small offerings to the future. There were nights I lay awake thinking of how my actions might teach my children to be generous or stingy, to be careful or careless. I had wanted them to be better than me in some ways. I suppose we all try to breed versions of ourselves that are slightly improved. I also remembered a more tender moment. The day Noor learned to say save instead of spend. It was raining that afternoon, and we pretended that the raindrops were coins falling from the sky. She collected those imaginary coins in an imaginary jar, and when she finally understood the idea, she clapped and made us both laugh until she hiccuped. That memory felt like a tiny flame in a winter window, warm, stubborn, and reminding me of the small reasons to keep going. We slept poorly that night. I woke early with a plan curling in my chest like a cat. The next morning I called the lawyer. I didn't want to be litigious by temperament, but sometimes the language of legal documents is the only thing that transforms private pain into public record. The lawyer I called was an old acquaintance, someone who had once taught me to read a contract when I was a young woman. He spoke in calm, precise sentences and told me what I suspected. The pattern of withdrawals could be pursued, but the cost and the emotional toll were considerations. He suggested mediation as an initial step. "You'll want to be strategic, Alara," he said. "Families break more often over money when they try to fight with swords instead of words. Mediation." I liked the sound of the word because it implied conversation and limits. It also gave my daughter the chance to own up without a trial. I wanted them to own up. I wanted them to hear the small sound of consequence. But before any legal thing could happen, something else arrived. A package in the post, brown paper and, slightly damp from rain, addressed to me in my sister's hand. Inside, folded in tissue, was a photograph I hadn't seen in decades. It was of Julian and my sister standing in front of a small house, arms around each other, looking foolish with youth. On the back, in a hurried scrawl, were 3 words: "Keep this safe." Under the photograph was another envelope sealed with wax. The wax was cracked, and the seal had an emblem I recognized from an old club my father once belonged to, an emblem I'd thought lost. The envelope held a slip of paper with a bank, account number, and a note. "If anything happens, this is where we left the rest." There was a name associated, a bank in the city, and a key phrase I'd never seen before. "Trust in quiet hands." My chest clenched. Quiet hands. Was this my sister's version of a safety net? A secret reserve of something like a fortune? But not the kind that shows on glossy magazines, something safer, more modest, but still more than enough to make a difference. My head buzzed with possibility and fear. Did the transfers, my daughter's withdrawals, tap into that account? Or had they only used my accessible savings? Noor watched me with a look that made me feel like the world was a stage and she had the best seat. "Is that the secret millions?" she asked, half hopeful, half wary. "Maybe," I said. "Maybe more likely it's sand and stones." I didn't want to raise expectations if there was nothing there. Hope without proof is a dangerous currency. But the envelope meant something. Someone had planned. Someone had hidden a small safety for the future. Why? And why was it left in my sister's possession with such cryptic instructions? I folded the paper and slid it into my handbag. That night I lay awake and listened to the house breathe. I thought about all the small ways we try to keep each other safe. Sometimes safety is a bank account. Sometimes it's the presence of a neighbor who checks the lights. Sometimes it's a ledger in a tin. I had all of these now, all of them messy and imperfect. There is a story I have not told you yet, one that has been in my pocket for years, because sometimes the deep thing is too heavy to carry in daylight. Julian, before his illness, had a brother who moved away and never returned. He promised once to help when money got tight. He promised to add his name to some documents and then the phone calls stopped. That absence taught me the brittle lesson that promises are often the first things to be taken back when it comes time to deliver. So we are at the point now where the conflict is broadening into a real search. Did my sister leave something larger hidden? Did the family access it? Were there other hands involved? The ledger gave us evidence. The wax envelope gave us a lead. The postcard and the beach made the cruelty visual. The storage locker gave us truth in paper form. The next step is to check the bank named on the slip. The old cautious voice in me says to prepare for disappointment. The small, stubborn voice in my chest says otherwise. The next morning, while the kettle was boiling and Noor was practicing her handwriting at the table, I called the bank on the slip. A polite woman in a voice-flattened cadence answered and asked for the account number. I gave it, heart in my mouth. She asked me to hold. On the line came the kind of silence that feels like being underwater. Then she returned. "Ma'am," she said, "this account has a balance that should not be here." I put my hand over my mouth because my words were not able to show up properly. The balance was not small. It was something that would complicate everything. I looked at Noor. She was still tracing the curve of the letter G with her finger, unknowing of the scale of the puzzle we had just found. I folded my hands in my lap and felt oddly light and stunned all at once. Share your story in the comments. Have you ever discovered something unexpected in a relative's things? Did it bring you comfort, confusion, or both? Tell me. I will read them here at my table with a pot of tea and the ledger open. We will move forward together. I held the back of a chair in a room smelling of lemon cleaner and paper and tried to remember how to breathe properly. Noor's small hand was in mine, a warm, steady pulse. We'd walked into that branch because the slip of paper in my sister's envelope had promised a place called Trust in Quiet Hands. We left with more than promise. We left with a name on a document and a smell that tasted like surprise. If part 1 was a wound and part 2 the careful mapping of what hurt, part 3 is where we pull at the threads and watch whole things unravel. This is the reveal. It's the scene where the camera moves in close and the creases in faces become topography. If you came for a tidy courtroom drama, you will be disappointed. This is quieter than that. It's the slow, stubborn unmasking of how little things, a ledger, a postcard, a brass key, can lead to truths that bite. We arrived at the bank early, fingers still warm from tea. Noor had a pencil behind her ear like a little detective. She'd been writing observations in a notebook, neat, deliberate notes you'd expect a child to take when they're learning the language of grown-ups. "Alara," she said in that matter-of-fact voice children have when they suspect the world has literal skeletons in its closet. "Do you think they'll be sorry?" "I don't know," I answered, "but we'll see." Mr. Hamid greeted us. He had been at the branch for decades, a man whose cardigan sleeves had bleached where his wrists rubbed the fabric, a man who seemed to have been trained by experience to keep a little extra reserve of decency in his face. He led us into a small office, the kind of glass room that announces confidentiality by making you feel like you're in a fishbowl, and closed the door with a respectful click. He pulled up an account on his screen and printed out a statement that smelled faintly of toner and new paper. The title on the statement read in crisp font, "The L&J Family Trust, Quiet Hands." My hand tightened around Noor's. L and J for my sister and Julian. My throat felt like a hallway with faucets running. "That's my sister's writing on the envelope," I said. "What is this trust?" "A trust, ma'am, is a legal arrangement," he said. He explained it simply. Someone sets it up, places assets inside, and the trustee is given directions on how to manage or distribute those assets. Sometimes trustees are family. Sometimes banks hold the trustee role. This one, according to our paperwork, has a trustee and named beneficiaries. "Where did it come from?" I asked. Mr. Hamid looked at me over his glasses as if weighing how much of the paper of the world I should be allowed to hold. He printed out another page. "It was set up years ago," he said. "Your sister and your husband, Julian, were the settlers. It appears they placed assets here in the event of certain conditions. The trust's terms are here in this folder." He opened a drawer, pulling out a file so thick it hummed like a bird. It unfolded into legal language I read like a foreign song. But between the phrases, I saw familiar things: dates, signatures, the little neat loops my sister liked to add at the end of a letter. There were clauses about support for descendants, about education, and about care for main surviving spouse. There was explicit instruction that the trust be used for needs if certain thresholds were reached. It read like a love letter written in legalese. Small protection wrapped in paperwork. My fingers found the place where Julian's name was, listed as co-trustee, and then my vision narrowed to a single line. There, written in a different hand, was an amendment, dated a fortnight before the beach postcard. The amendment read as something tame and administrative on the surface. Temporary administrative access granted to M.A., daughter. Beneath it was a signature that looked like mine. I didn't move for a breath. "I did not sign that," I said, felt it like a stone thrown, then clattered. My voice seemed distant. Noor's pencil scribbled. "But it's your handwriting, Grandma," she said softly, head cocked like a bird. I had to look closer. Signatures change, of course, and old hands age. The loops tighten or slacken. But there was something else about that mark, a confident stroke I did not recognize. The date was recent. My brain did that strange thing where it supplied 100 possibilities because the truth felt too heavy to land all at once. Mr. Hamid folded his hands. "We have a notarized authorization," he said, producing another paper with a stamp and a small, round seal. This was presented at our branch and verified with an ID and a witness. "It grants your daughter administrative rights to manage certain distributions. It appears to have been used to withdraw funds for various purposes." He pointed at a line on the printout. Several withdrawals, each labeled as administrative transfer. My mouth tasted of metal. The word withdrawals became a chorus. The ledger in the storage locker suddenly had a broader echo. I felt like a fox caught in floodlights, illuminated, vulnerable, suddenly incapable of making movement count. Noor squeezed my hand. She had that fierce little set to her jaw children sometimes own when they are watching an injustice. "Who notarized it?" I asked, though I knew what the answer might be. "People make forgeries. People also coax signatures with smiles and small compulsive kindness. There's a difference between fraud and manipulation. Whatever it was, it had a face. It's notarized at the Eastwood office," Mr. Hamid said. "We must follow protocol to disclose details, but I can provide you copies if you authorize it in writing." "So give me everything," I said. The words surprised me because I said them steady, not like someone balanced on wobble legs. He printed copies. They looked like any other bureaucratic thing, staples, typed letters that felt intent on being correct. But when I held them, they burned with a new heat. The notarized paper bore my name. There was a witness signature that I recognized from the bakery, a man who used to buy morning buns by the dozen. That was odd. Was it collusion or coincidence? We took the papers home and spread them across the table like artifacts on a lab bench. The room felt smaller, which is the way rooms behave when secrets are heavy. Noor traced each line gently as if she were exploring a map. She had the patience of a person trying to understand terrain without having to cross a single bridge yet. "We need a handwriting expert," I said, thinking aloud. "We need timestamps, phone records, anything that proves whether that authorization came from me." Noor's head swiveled. "Is there a person who tells truth from lies on paper?" "There are people who compare loops and slants and pressure," I said. "Yes." We found a small, respected forensic document analyst in town, Mrs. Khan, who smelled of jasmine and lived above a tiny tea shop. She welcomed us in as if we were family, as if all the world's troubles could be softened with tea and careful scrutiny. She laid the notarized document on the table beside a page of my own handwriting, old letters I'd written to Julian and notes in old ledgers. She sighed, not in resignation but in concentration. "Signatures change," she said, fingering the papers. "But there are particular elements. The rhythm, the starting point, the pressure at certain strokes. She took a magnifying glass like a wise woman taking an exam of leaves under a sun. After a while, she looked up. "There's a similarity," she said slowly. "But the pressure pattern suggests the hand that signed the authorization was steady, and there's a hesitation at the beginning of certain letters that we don't see consistently in your earlier samples. I would say it's possible someone traced your signature. A trace." My first reaction was to picture a carefully practiced forging, the kind they show in films. My second reaction was grief, because the idea of someone tracing my signature as if it were a path to be followed felt like a spiritual theft. Not only had they taken my money, they had taken a mark that used to be mine. We took the documents back to the bank. The bank was kind in the clinical way institutions can be when they want to be helpful but not too expensive. They opened an investigation. There were forms. There were calls to a hotline. There was the slow mechanism of systems built for fairness. It's a peculiar thing. You trust in systems until you really need them. Then you see the cogs. They'll work, but they work on time, precise, bureaucratic time. That will always be slower than human hurt. The investigation turned up calls to the Eastwood notary. The notary confirmed that the person who provided identification at the time of notarization had an ID matching my name, but that the signature on the ID did not closely match the signature on the authorization. There was also a security tape, one of those grainy old recordings at the notary office that shows people moving like ghosts. In it, a woman whose height and posture resembled my daughter entered, spoke, and left with papers. The face was not clear. The angle of the camera made people look like different species. But the woman wore a scarf the same color I had once given my daughter years ago. I sat with that tape in my hands like a photograph that had smeared. Nor watched it, and her eyebrows drew together. "They hid under a scarf," she said bluntly. Like a movie. Her observation, I thought, was both hilarious and accurate. People think they can cover themselves with fabric and be invisible, but traces remain. A pattern of transactions, a ledger in storage, a wax seal. The bank, cautious and thorough, put a temporary freeze on the trust's distributions while the investigation proceeded. That felt like a reprieve, like a small, righteous closure. But it also meant the family might rally in defense. People protect their sense of self, sometimes by polarizing the world into allies and enemies. I expected fireworks. I also expected tears. Neither of those are crimes. We called my daughter. She was on the other end of the phone like a taut wire. Her voice went thin when I told her about the notarized authorization. "I did what I had to do, Mama," she said. There was a trembling there that might have been contrition, but it also felt like fear. Fear and guilt are close roommates in people who have crossed lines. "You did what you had to do?" I repeated. "Yes." She inhaled. "We were going under. I couldn't tell you because you'd worry. You would have tried to stop us, and then we'd have all failed together. I had to be practical." "Practical," I said. The word sat between us. Practical at the expense of truth? She stopped speaking for a moment, the way someone stops when they realize they are looking into a mirror and they don't like what looks back. "I'm sorry," she finally said. It was small. It did not match the weight of what it covered. "We'll fix it." "I don't want your money back like a receipt," I said. The phrase that had felt so firm in the family meeting tasted like glass now. "I want you to tell the truth to yourself and to the bank. I want you to accept the consequences of what you did." She made a sound at the other end that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. People make complicated sounds when their privacy is breached and their conscience goes public. I imagined her in their sunlit room, phone propped against a pillow, calcium light from the screen making her face paler than the tan in the photos. I wanted to believe in her apology. I wanted to be the mother who forgives. But there is also a line between wanting and worthiness. Meanwhile, the world offered its own small revelations. A neighbor had seen my daughter deposit cash into an account on the same day she had posted the postcard. The neighbor's testimony was a small arrow. People who own small towns know how to keep track of small, unglamorous details. These whispers do not make a case on their own, but they add to the chorus. There were also private letters my sister had left in the trunk at the storage locker, letters she had written in the months before she died. In them she was practical and somewhat weary. She had written of wanting assets to be used for care, if ever my siblings need it. She had been specific about honesty. Not just the money, she wrote in a thin, slanted hand. The way we look at each other afterward. I read that letter until the edges blurred. My sister had trusted me, and I felt that trust like a blank check of emotional responsibility. She had spoken of quiet hands for a reason. She had wanted the trust to be a kind of balm. She had never imagined it would one day become a wedge. There was a deeper reveal, too. One that made my stomach turn with a mix of anger and protectiveness. The trust, it turned out, had been funded not just by money in the bank, but by a modest property my sister had owned in the countryside. That property had value, real value. Somewhere in the creases of property valuations and local negotiations, someone had made a plan. The property's title had an annotation on one page: conditional release. The property was supposed to be sold only under particular conditions and with multiple signatures. Yet recent months had seen an application to release some funds tied to that property. I sat back and thought of Julian standing in front of Small Things. How he'd always liked the smell of the countryside and the way the wind could arrange a field like a garment. He used to say, "Land is a kind of memory." I had never imagined that memory would be parceled out like cash and used to buy sunlit postcards. When we confronted my daughter with the things we'd found, the conversation turned jagged. I tried to explain the trust's terms in simple sentences, like a teacher trying to keep the class calm. She listened, and at times she seemed genuinely contrite. At other times she grew defensive, the old armor returning like an unhelpful reflex. I asked why she'd signed the authorization or presented it. She said she hadn't forged my signature. She repeated the phrase, "I did what I had to do," so many times that the words lost meaning. It was what you say when you are trying to make God into an accomplice. I wanted to be dramatic. I thought of courtroom scenes in films and speeches that change hearts. But the truth is quieter. The real confrontation felt like sutures at the dinner table. We argued in small, dangerous things, voices pitched like instruments in a too-small room. Nor sat between us, frowning, occasionally scribbling. She would later tell me she was taking notes for the story she would tell her own children someday. Children are good at turning family chaos into mythology. The bank's legal team requested a temporary injunction while they completed their review. The trust was effectively paused. It felt like a victory and a weight. The pause gave me time to breathe and also time to think of what I wanted to do if the bank found forgery or manipulation. What justice would look like for an old woman whose main crimes had been generosity and trust. I thought of quiet justice, not dramatic revenge, but a repair that restores dignity. I thought of returning boundaries instead of burning bridges. I thought of setting conditions for any return of funds: transparency, counseling, a schedule of restitution, and a clause that any further access required mutual consent. I wanted them to learn the language of accountability, not just the bitterness of being caught. There was one last reveal that evening, the one that made the world tilt: a call from the notary office. They'd found a clerk's notebook, and in it were notes that matched the handwriting of my daughter. The clerk's notebook mentioned an arrangement where ID would be presented and a witness in attendance. It was the puzzle piece that sketched in the edges of a picture. Someone at the notary had been willing to assist, perhaps by omission, perhaps by wholehearted help. It's a strange sorrow to realize that your child has the resourcefulness to do what is wrong, but not the courage to do what is right. The reveal hurt, not because my daughter had misused funds. The hurt was there, yes, but because she had built a bridge of deceit out of her own hands and walked across to the sun. That night, as I sat at the table and drank tea that no longer tasted entirely safe, Nor came to me with a folded piece of mail she'd found beneath a stack of my old bills. It was addressed to be opened upon discovery of misuse. I felt my knees go soft. My sister, ever cautious, had left a contingency, instructions for moments precisely like this. I unfolded it with hands that trembled like a leaf in cold wind. The envelope contained a list of names and a short, single-line note. If you must uncover, follow the fourth name. The fourth name was one I recognized, not a relative but an old friend of Julian's, someone who had once worked in municipal records and liked to keep secrets in his pocket, like loose change. I looked at Noor. "Tomorrow," I said, and the word had the weight of a bell. "Tomorrow we go see him. Share your story in the comments. Have you ever uncovered a family secret that changed everything? Did you choose forgiveness, confrontation, or something in between? Tell me what you did. I'll read every word at my table with Noor and a pot of tea. We will not be alone as we walk this path. They say climaxes in stories are loud. In real life, they often arrive like a drawer sliding shut, sudden, decisive, and impossible to ignore. Part 4 is the confrontation. It's where the slow, patient work of collecting facts becomes a motion with teeth. It's where the ledger, the wax-sealed note, the storage locker, and the photocopies we'd made all converge into a single thing: exposure. We left before dawn again. Noor slept through our hurried packing, but when she woke, she found a small paper crown I'd fashioned from the ledger's photocopies and put it on her head. She took it solemnly, not like a joke, but like a talisman. Children understand ceremony without needing instruction. The city was cool and damp. The scent of rain had washed the streets clean, like a hand that's been rubbed briskly with soap. Julian's old friend, Rashid, lived in a house that leaned a little, a place full of books that smelled of dust and cloves. His front door had a brass knob polished by 1,000 visits. He met us on the porch, wearing a sweater with elbow patches and 2 days of beard that made him look like someone who collected small confessions in the folds of his clothing. He ushered us inside with the kind of smile people reserve for friends who've returned from storms. Inside his study there were stacks of municipal maps, a battered radio, and a file cabinet that creaked like an old ship when you pulled a drawer. He made tea that tasted of cardamom and something older. Hospitality served as if it were an offering, not a convenience. Rashid had been a clerk in municipal records for years. He'd whispered to me once that records sometimes keep secrets that the living try to bury. He believed paper is a stubborn animal. It resists being entirely rewritten. We talked for a while like two old ladies discussing weather, gentle as weather, a surface conversation to warm the tea. Then he reached under his desk and placed an envelope in front of me. It had no name, only a date, 2 months before the postcard. My fingers, which had learned the economy of careful movements, opened it as if it might burst into flames. Inside were copies of transfer orders, documents that linked a string of withdrawals to an account not in the name of my daughter, but to a small property company, one used for property purchases in the county. There was a copy of a deed transfer, too, with the countryside property's title reassigned under a shell name. The legalese on the page read like a language trying to hide a motive. I felt the slow, hot rush of anger, but also the colder, cleaner taste of fact. The deed wasn't only a paper. It was a story of decisions made in secret. Rashid cleared his throat. "I kept these," he said. "Julian asked me years ago to keep an eye on some paperwork if anything happened. He said, if ever Alara needs proof, find the man with the elbow patches and tell him to look behind the 3rd row." I thought he meant a joke, but I kept them just the same. I pressed my hand to the paper and felt lighter and heavier at once. Lighter because a suspicion had become a fact. Heavier because facts have consequences. Noor leaned closer, the paper light in her small hands. "Did they sell Grandma's land?" she whispered. "It looks like there was a transfer," Rashid said. "But there's more." He pulled out a small cassette tape, old technology, black plastic, the sort you use to record voices that don't want to be erased easily. "Julian recorded things sometimes," he said. "When he thought the house was listening better than men. He left a recording labeled 'For Alara if needed.' I never played it. I thought it was too intimate. But maybe now." His fingers were gentle with the tape like a man handling an artifact. I sat very still and thought of Julian, a man who had loved bread like a prayer and who recorded his voice as if he might be a troubadour. I popped the tape into an old player Rashid had on the shelf. The sound was thin at first, then thickened into Julian's voice, tired, amused, and unmistakably him. "Alara," Julian said from a past winter. "If you ever hear this, forgive my being clumsy in life. I am leaving some things behind. I don't trust banks entirely, but I trust Rashid. He knows how to find things when hands forget. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me this trust will be used for care and not vanish in the sun of other people's holidays." The tape went on, a dated domestic manifesto, lists of properties, small accounts, and the phrase "quiet hands" repeated like a benediction. The voice on tape was not the volatile man of occasional rage. It was a man acquainted with small, finite sacrifices and the need to protect the people he loved. Rashid's face grew still. "Someone forged the paperwork to allow access," he said in a low voice after the tape ended. "They used a chain of witnesses who weren't properly checked. They used old IDs, a helpful clerk, someone who owed a debt to a kindness, and they moved the asset. They moved it like a magician making a coin disappear. We sat in the aftermath like people who've witnessed a small war." Noor's lower lip trembled, and she hid it under her hand. "Why would they do it?" she asked again. The question was both simple and enormous. "They needed money," Rashid said bluntly. "Or they wanted the land. Or they were afraid and thought action would be easier than asking." He chewed his lip like someone thinking of language for something that had no good words. "Sometimes it's greed, sometimes fear. They're cousins in how messy they make things. I thought of my daughter in the photographs, smiles like polished coins, tan skin under a sun I'd paid for. I thought of payback promised like a perfume that wears off." We left Rashid's house with copies of the documents and the tape tucked neatly in my bag. He walked us to the gate, held my hands for a moment, and said, "Alara, they'll likely try to divide the story into small pieces. Don't let them. Keep the whole picture. Confrontation is different from exposure. Exposure is the shutter of a camera pulled back. Confrontation is a table where people sit and things are said out loud. Back home, I arranged for a conversation to happen, with witnesses and a mediator present. I wanted sunlight and not the darkness of accusations tossed in private. I wanted accountability with dignity. I wanted them to know they were known." We met in the living room that Sunday. I had lit the candles in the same place I had with the noodles. Candles have a way of making good intentions visible. The bank's investigator came, a lean woman named Amrita, who smelled faintly of mint and competence. Rashid joined us via a quiet video call. He looked tired but resolved. My daughter and son-in-law arrived with a small bundle of uneasiness. Noor sat on the floor with a toy soldier at her side, not playing but present in the way children are when they choose to witness. I read the documents aloud. The words fell into the room with weight. I could tell by the way my daughter's fingers curled that each sentence landed like a pebble in her belly. When I read Julian's tape excerpt, there was a long pause, as if the room inhaled him. He was there somehow, better than any person could have been at that moment. My daughter's face changed color the way tides change. She began to speak, hesitating at first, then with a flood. She told us about bulging bills and shame and panic, and the sense that she alone could be the savior if she acted quickly enough. Her explanation was a spiral: truth, then defense, then truth again. She admitted presenting paperwork at the Eastwood notary. She admitted persuading a clerk to accept a photocopy when originals were thin on the ground. She admitted that someone else, an agent she'd contacted about selling land, had been involved in the deed transfer. I listened, feeling the raw tenderness that comes with hearing someone confess. There was contrition, yes, but also a brittle edge. I thought I was protecting us. Protecting us. The phrase had the ring of myth-making. Noor's face reddened. "You weren't protecting Grandma," she said in a voice that damned any sympathy I might have had for her. "You were protecting your vacation." My daughter's reaction was immediate, a flinch like a struck animal. She crouched to Noor's level and tried to explain. "We were drowning." I panicked. "I thought I could fix everything before you found out." She really did mean the fixing. Panic writes strange scripts. The mediator, calm, exact, guided the conversation like a gardener pruning branches. She asked for actions rather than apologies. It was the difference between an apology made to feel better and an apology that rearranges the world. She suggested restitution plans, a timeline, and supervised access to accounts. She suggested therapy and financial counseling. She suggested the worst medicine, transparency. That night, in my small bedroom, I couldn't sleep. My mind, trained for years to count coins and stitch hems, ran through the calculus of consequences. I kept thinking of Rashid's words, "You don't deserve to be the last to know." I thought of Julian's voice on the tape saying, "Quiet hands." The trust had been meant as a gentle room where a woman could rest. It had been turned into a market stall where things were priced and sold. Flashbacks came, sharp and cinematic. I saw the bakery in my mind's eye, the oven door like a chest opening to let out bread-scented prayers. I saw Julian with flour on his cheek, whistling a tune that used to make the air lighter. I saw my daughter as a child, her hair in a messy curl, learning to stir batter with a stick too big for her hands. These images were a balm and an ache all at once. Then the twist. It came when Amrita, the bank investigator, who had been quietly assembling the timeline like a jeweler setting stones, looked up from her folder and said, "We've got a problem." Her voice was not alarmist, merely factual, but the room seemed to tilt on its axis. "What is it?" I asked. "There's an attempted wire transfer," she said. "An urgent request to move remaining trust funds overseas. It was initiated within the last 24 hours. We were able to flag it because of our temporary freeze, but it looks like someone is trying to circumvent the system." My stomach lurched. "Who?" I demanded. She didn't have an immediate answer. "It's coming from an external account tied to an agency that was used in the deed sale," she said. "We're tracing the IP. We've alerted compliance. But if they move quickly, if they've prepared shell accounts abroad, it could be messy." I felt the room shrink. The documents and confessions and tearful apologies were suddenly overlaid with a new sense of urgency. The ledger, the tape, the deed, they were all evidence of a wider net. Someone, or several someones, were orchestrating a plan to extract what little remained before the bank could legally reclaim it. Noor's small hand found mine and squeezed. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, and the truth was simple. We were going to try to stop it. We were going to try to hold quiet hands in a world where fingers are quick and eager. We coordinated then, in the way one plans a small siege. Amrita promised to keep the freeze. Rashid offered to visit the municipal offices where the deed passed hands and search for any paperwork mismatches. The mediator would draft a legal agreement for restitution and bind the family to it. And I, who'd felt like a ghost in my own house for weeks, called a lawyer and asked for emergency injunction papers to be filed by morning. Confrontations change people in ways you can't predict. My daughter, who had floundered in her own remorse, suddenly stood upright with a kind of solid new fear. People show their better faces when the consequences are immediate. She agreed to the mediated plan. She agreed to the timeline. She promised to cooperate with the bank's investigators. Whether promises hold is another matter. The weather sometimes breaks the most earnest plans. But for now, she had chosen a path that included confession and reparation. The moral turning point came unexpectedly and quietly. I could have chosen to press criminal charges. I had evidence. The bank had grounds. A prosecutor might have been interested in a case of forged documents. I considered the satisfaction that might bring. Public vindication, perhaps, the thrill of being right. But revenge, as I've learned, is an expensive garment that seldom fits well. I'm not naive. Justice matters. But so does family. There is a line for me between guarding dignity and punishing until no one is left whole. I chose a middle way, to insist on accountability, but to keep a hand open for reconciliation that would require work, transparency, and healing. That night, after the big meeting broke up and the house settled, Noor came and sat on my bed with a small, serious expression. "Grandma," she said, "do you still think they love you?" I thought of the way my daughter's hand had trembled. I thought of the way she had once sung lullabies into a small, sleeping face. Love is not erased simply because someone is selfish. Love is a messy ledger, too. "I think they used to," I said finally. "I think they do in some ways. But love is not permission. Love doesn't let you take what keeps someone alive." Noor wrapped her arms around my neck and pressed her cheek to my shoulder. "We'll keep the door open," she said, "but we'll lock the drawer." We slept poorly that night. I woke before dawn with a heavy sense that the story was not finished. That was when my phone chimed, one short, precise note. It was Amrita. "We've placed the freeze, but we see another attempted login from a VPN. It's going to be tough to track if they move quickly. The bank's compliance team suggests we get the local authorities involved now." I put my hand over my mouth. The taste of adrenaline was metallic. As I pulled on my coat to leave for the bank, Noor handed me a small folded note she'd found tucked into the spine of the ledger photocopy. It was in my sister's handwriting. If things go sideways, go to the old post office. There's a letter addressed to, for when the trust is tested. My feet felt like they were running in place. The old post office had been shuttered for years, but there were rumors it still kept boxes and unsent letters in a drawer for anyone who asked. I thought of Rashid's records, Julian's tape, and now this, another breadcrumb in a trail someone had left intentionally. Tomorrow, I told Noor, we go to the post office. And we stay awake until the bank tells us they've stopped the wire for good. Share your story in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between justice and keeping family together? How did you decide? Tell me. I'll read every story at my table with tea and a ledger open between us. We'll walk to the post office together. By the time the sun rose, my small house smelled of nervous tea. I'd boiled the kettle 3 times already without meaning to drink from it. The ledger photocopies, the deed transfer documents, Julian's cassette tape, they all lay spread on my dining table like the chapters of a book waiting to be bound. Noor sat beside me, swinging her legs, her paper crown crinkled, but still perched on her head. She hadn't taken it off since Rashid gave us those copies, as if wearing the crown meant she was a guardian of the story. We had 2 destinations that morning: the bank, where Amrita promised to hold the freeze, and the shuttered post office, where my sister's cryptic note pointed. Both were heavy with possibility, one tied to stopping the theft, the other to discovering what might have been hidden all along. I thought of Julian, as I often did in moments like this. He would have baked a loaf of bread that morning, the yeast rising like faith, to give us courage before stepping out. Instead, I tucked Noor's hand in mine and whispered a small prayer, my lips brushing the lace curtain as the morning light poured in. We reached the bank first. Amrita met us at the side entrance, her trench coat damp from the drizzle, her hair tied back like a soldier preparing for battle. She ushered us quickly inside, away from the bustle of clients, into a conference room lined with glass walls. Behind those walls, I could see the hum of clerks and managers. The world outside kept moving while my own world felt as though it was on trial. She laid out a stack of papers. "We stopped the wire," she said without ceremony. But whoever initiated it was determined. They tried 3 times. Each attempt used a different VPN, bouncing through servers abroad. That takes resources. Someone's either paying good money or has professional help. "Did you trace it?" I asked, my voice thin but steady. Amrita nodded. "We traced it far enough to know this wasn't just your daughter. She didn't have the skill or the tools. The external account was linked to the property agency she contacted. They're known for gray practices. It looks like she opened the door and they walked right through with bigger intentions." Noor gasped. So they were using Mom?" "Yes," Amrita said gently. But she still played her part. She gave them access. The weight of betrayal deepened. It wasn't just family weakness. It was strangers with sharp teeth who smelled opportunity. My stomach twisted at the thought of Julian's careful trust being handled like loose change in the pocket of men who never knew him. Amrita tapped the final sheet of paper. "The good news? With the freeze in place and the deed trail Rashid uncovered, we have a strong case to reverse the transfer. If you sign here, we can begin proceedings to reclaim the property. It won't be quick, but it will be possible. Without the documents you found, though," she trailed off. We both knew what she meant. Without those breadcrumbs, it would have been gone. I signed, my hand trembling. Noor squeezed my arm proudly. "You're saving Grandpa's gift," she whispered. After the bank, we walked to the old post office. It was a squat, red-bricked building with boarded windows and a heavy iron door chained loosely, as if it were pretending to be closed, but still half alive. A small sign read, "Archives by appointment only." Inside, dust floated like tiny ghosts. An old clerk with eyebrows like storm clouds shuffled forward. His name tag read Mr. Green. His voice was dry as parchment. "What are you looking for?" I held out the folded note. "My sister once mentioned a letter left here, addressed to for when the trust is tested. Do you keep letters like that?" He squinted at the note. "We keep everything. Some say too much." He led us down a hallway that smelled of paper and rain. The shelves were endless rows of boxes, each one labeled with years, names, and numbers. Finally, he stopped at a drawer near the back. With a grunt, he pulled it open. Inside lay a single yellowing envelope, thick with time. Across the front, in my sister's familiar script, "For Ilara. Open only when the ground shakes." My hands trembled as I lifted it. Noor leaned so close her hair brushed my arm. Slowly, I tore the seal. Inside was a letter and a key. The letter was short, my sister's voice ringing clear even after all these years. "Dearest Ilara, if you are reading this, then the family has faltered, and Julian's quiet trust has been tested. You must know he left more than you were told. He confided in me once, when the bakery was failing, that he created a second nest, a modest account in your name, hidden to protect against greed. He feared not banks but people. The key unlocks box 117 at the savings cooperative across town. I never told a soul, because I promised him silence until the time was right. If now is that time, go. And remember, love must guide the money, or it will burn the hands that hold it." I pressed the letter to my chest. Julian, always one step ahead, always planting seeds in soil he wasn't sure he'd see grow. Tears blurred my eyes. Noor whispered reverently, "He left you a secret treasure." "Not treasure," I corrected softly. "A lifeline." We hurried to the small savings cooperative. Unlike the bank's glass and steel coldness, this place smelled of varnish and old pencils. The clerk, a kindly woman with silver hair, examined the key and my ID. Then, with a nod, she led us to a row of metal boxes. Box 117 clicked open, stiff from years of waiting. Inside was a small packet of papers and a velvet pouch. My breath caught as I opened the pouch to find a simple gold locket. Inside, 2 tiny pictures, Julian on one side, Noor's mother as a child on the other. The paper packet contained documents, proof of a savings account with a sum that, while not enormous, was enough to ensure I'd never have to beg or depend on anyone again. Julian had been right to hide it. Without this, I might have been cornered, desperate, at the mercy of those who used my trust against me. With it I had dignity, quiet, steady dignity. Noor slipped the locket around my neck. "Now Grandpa's with you," she said. I wept then, openly, letting the years of exhaustion pour out. When we returned home, my daughter was waiting. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed red from crying. She'd heard about the blocked wire transfer, the investigator, the restitution plan. She knew the tide had turned. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, her voice breaking. "But I want to try. I want to fix this." I listened. My heart warred with itself, anger on one side, love on the other. Finally, I said, "Fixing starts with truth. And with work. You can't undo what you've done, but you can choose differently now." She nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. "I will. I didn't embrace her then. Some wounds need time. But I didn't close the door either. Like Noor had said, we would keep the door open, but lock the drawer. That night, after the storm had passed, I sat with Noor in the glow of a single lamp. She curled into my side, her paper crown now torn and wrinkled, but still proudly perched. "Grandma," she whispered, "are you happy now?" I thought about it, truly thought. Happiness, at 75, wasn't a roaring fire. It was embers glowing quietly, enough to keep you warm if you cup your hands close. "Yes," I said softly. Because the truth came out. Because Grandpa's love still finds its way to me, even years later. And because I have you, she hugged me tight. When I'm grown, I'll never let you eat alone again. The ache of my birthday faded in that promise. To anyone listening, anyone reading, betrayal hurts. It cuts sharper when it comes from family, from those you raised with tender hands. But even betrayal cannot erase dignity, or love, or truth. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in a dusty post office drawer or in a cassette tape left for the right moment. If you've ever sat alone when you should have been surrounded, know this: your story isn't finished. There are still letters waiting to be found, still children with paper crowns who will hold your hand and ask the questions that save you. I am Ilara, and I ate alone on my 75th birthday. But I will never eat alone again. Have you ever been betrayed by the ones you trusted most? How did you find your way back to peace? Share your story in the comments. I promise I'll read them with a cup of tea by my side. And if you believe in quiet justice, in resilience, and in the kind of love that survives even the deepest cuts, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your stories keep mine alive. And that, my dear, the victory is not in revenge, but in dignity restored, truth uncovered, and love passed forward like a locket around the neck.